Okay, today we're going to talk about the Roland TR-8S and how we can optimize the sampling process to put samples onto the machine. Now, sadly, this beautiful beast isn't going to be used today for this demo, but actually what it's all about is getting things on here. Now, some people call the TR-8S a sampler. That's not true. It's a sample player with sample and synthesis. That means it has things like filters, envelopes, effects, and it also has the ACB2 built-in synthesis engine. But the actual TR-8S itself only has 10 minutes of sampling time. You think, well, that's plenty. But that's 10 minutes at 16-bit and 44 kilohertz mono. So if you take that and then make that stereo, well, that's twice as much information. Linear WAV PCM, pulse code modulation, is pretty much uncompressed. It's pretty much a raw format. So if you record something in stereo, then you've only got 5 minutes of recording. If you record it at 96 kilohertz, then suddenly you've actually got less than 2.5 minutes of recording. If you record at 24-bit, then you're probably less than a minute. So, in order to actually use your TR-8S with a large number of samples, then actually what you want to be doing, in my opinion, is to be actually maximizing that sample space by mixing down to mono, by recording or at least exporting at 16-bit and 44 kilohertz. Now, there is also a limitation. I think it's 300 or 400 samples it can store inside the machine. So if you are using quite short samples, you might actually run out of sample slots before you run out of memory. But that's okay, I think. The TR-8S is not meant to be a phrase sampler like the SP404, which is good for phrases. This is meant to be a rhythm sampler. So what we're going to start with is a demonstration of how I record into what's in front here. This is Zoom R24. I've got my microphone plugged into it. This is being recorded on a separate track. So although obviously noise coming from my microphone, it's on a separate track, it's on a separate WAV file to what's being recorded here in stereo. This means that I can do some interesting things around leaving myself audio notes as I go along recording. So I'm going to start, first of all, getting levels right. So here's a Volca kick. Now, it's important to get I've got it going into the amber there. It's not clipping, so you don't want it too quiet because you lose all that, the bottom end of the range. You lose this. If you don't record sound, you can't use it later on. You can't put in sound that isn't there. That's too quiet. This is now clipping, but also it's showing that actually my right channel is slightly hotter than my left channel because it's going into the red. So I just need to adjust the gain on my left channel a little bit. That's about even now. Now I'll bring it back down again. There's the little peak lights on here, and these aren't flashing up anymore. Maybe just turn it up a tiny bit so it occasionally touches them. Okay. Now, the Volca kick is actually pretty noisy sometimes, especially if you put it through another mixer and through some compression. So, this is how I record. What I'll tend to do is I will say kicks. And then when I go to the next section, I'll say something else. And what I'll do is if I load this mono track in that's been recorded from the microphone, what will happen is I then actually have my own cue as to which section I'm recording for. It can get very confusing if you've recorded thousands of samples as to where you are in your recording. So that's the basic recording. This is an SD card recorder. So I just pop the SD card out, which is in the side here, and put it in my PC, and it's just a WAV file. I can load it in. So I'm going to show one thing. I recorded off the kick through my MX1 and through a mic and through a looper, and actually it had quite a lot of noise. So I'm going to show you how I fix noise as well. So we've got the levels right. They're not clipping. They're not too quiet. We know where we are with the recording. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to move the camera, and I'm going to show you what I did for the Volca kick samples to make them sound better. So I'm going to bring these levels down and plug into my laptop. Okay, so here's my stereo recording of the kick, which makes no sense anyways, it's a mono, but that's by the by. Now, if we listen to this, we can probably hear, if I just go halfway through, we can probably hear there's some hiss. Might not be audible on YouTube. Now I'm hoping you can hear that hiss. There's a hiss every time it's got by the gate on the MX1. Right, so I'll just stop that. How I fixed that is to find a sample of the hiss at the end, which I recorded purposefully. You can hope you hear that. Nice long piece of hiss. What I do is I go to the effect, and I go to noise reduction. And it says get noise profile. So you need to have selected several seconds of noise for that to happen. Click get noise profile, and it seemingly just goes away. Now, if I take a piece of noisy audio, and then I go noise reduction again. Now I'll listen to the samples. Now hopefully, if YouTube hasn't kind of edited out all the hiss, you can hear that now that hiss is gone. Much better. Okay, so that's basically how to get your samples into the right kind of state to be processed. So one of the other things I do is now the Volca kick doesn't have any effects, but something like the Volca drum, or yesterday I was recording an EMU command station, is quite often they have effects on them. Now, once an effect's recorded into a sample, you can't remove that effect easily. Now, if you're doing something like, say, a gated, really tight gated reverb, maybe you actually do want to record that onto the sample. But in this project that I'm working with here, actually, I wanted to record everything dry, and I can then add as many effects on as I want to later on. So here's my effectively my vocal track, telling me which section I'm on. So if I just play that, you can hear my own vocal cues and some background noise. It doesn't matter because it's not in the final mix. Salsa. Yep. So I'm going to take this tribal section here. So I know this next one's tribal, and I can see I've got this set of waveforms here. I select them, Control C, put them into a new Audacity window, Control V, bang. Now you can see the individual things. Now one thing that's really important to do is I could normalize here. And here's an important tip. There's normalization, limiting and compression. Normalizing of a sample, what it does is it tends to take the bit at the peak and treat that as the peak, and it normalizes towards that peak. So that might make that peak quieter, it might make that peak louder, and it proportionally applies that to the rest of the sample. So that means that in some cases, if you've got a very loud attack here, like on this wave here, some of these very quiet samples could actually get made quieter still. What you want to do is you only want to normalize per sample. You want to normalize per sample to get that level right. And it's different to compression, where it actually kind of reduces the overall range of the quietness and the loudness, and the limiter, which kind of just effectively cuts off the top. So if I just normalized all of these samples at once in an attempt to be efficient, what I would end up doing is I'd take, because this one's got a very big attack transient here, I would make these two quiet. But actually, I want to probably make this first one quieter, and some of these ones here that are a little bit quieter, I want to make them a bit louder. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to chop this up. Now, I could do that by hand, but that would be terribly tedious. I've actually got a macro to do it. But first, before I do that, I'm going to do tracks, mix stereo down to mono. Now, if you've got something like a phaser effect on, or some kind of stereo panning effect, or something that otherwise changes the stereo field too much, that can actually create some kind of phase cancellation, which can be bad. Now, in my case, because I've recorded these dry, although there was some stereo on these samples, it hasn't really affected the waves that much. So you've got to be careful about phase cancellation. And also, if you're recording from something like an EMX or a machine drum, there's a good chance you could be actually with inverted phase anyway. So what you want to do is, if you feel like your drums somehow aren't sitting in the mix and they feel like they're actually quietening the mix, you can use the invert phase tool. I think that's an effect on here. There's invert. Phase inversion might fix that. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take this and I'm going to chop this up into a load of samples. So we've got some macros. I've pre-built a macro called Silence Trimmer, and it's basically got a truncate silence in there with a bunch of parameters. I've decided to put the threshold at minus 50 decibels, which is quite quiet, and then export as WAV. So I'm going to select the files. Sorry, I'm going to run that macro after I've actually split these files. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to do Silence Finder. Silence Finder is going to find all these gaps, and you see it's found all these gaps. Then I'm going to do an export multiple. So file, export multiple. I'm going to give it a new directory called test, because I don't want these. Create a directory, and then it's going to export them, and it'll go crunch, crunch, crunch. If I look in here, I've got a bunch of samples. So now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to run the macro. I'm going to close this down. I don't need this anymore. I'm going to choose the files I've just created. Do Control A. And what it's doing now is it's basically trimming silence off and re-exporting the file. This might take a few seconds. The good thing is, if you've got loads of files to process, you can go away and make a cup of tea for this one. And one thing to note as well, when you're recording samples, if you're recording something, say, that you want to be melodic, it's worthwhile recording kind of in a key. And then what you can do is record everything in key of C, and then whatever other keys you actually want to record in. It's easier than using the pitching on the TR-8S, which can be fiddly. I mean, you can use the coarse tune, but then you lose an automation knob. Also, if you're going to be going very low with your drums, record some low versions, because again, you are relying, if you're recording from an analog source, that'll go low and stay smooth. If you are using a sample and you down pitch it too much, what it's going to do is going to start sounding rough. So what I want to do now is I'm going to actually, it's automatically created a macro output folder, which is where the processed files are. So I'm going to delete these originals, so I don't want them. Go into macro output here. So let's have a look at a wave file. So this one, it's done a particularly bad job of figuring out where the silence is. It's a good example. So obviously, if I play this now, it will sound of something. It's like a little kind of muted tom, I think. So what I want to do now is I want to chop off the beginning. So what I'll do is I'll use Control-1 and zoom in. What I want to do is I want to get as close to the beginning as possible and delete that beginning. Okay, so now I've got the beginning. Zoom back out a little bit. Now, but one thing here is it looks like there's a load of silence on the end. It looks like there's loads of silence, but that might be deceptive. I'll show you. Listen. There is some of the sound there. Now, if you actually pull this down and zoom in, well, actually you can start to see, it's difficult to see maybe on the camera, there are actually parts of the waves here. So in order to keep all of that, you can just leave it as it is. Now, however, though, when the silence trimmer kicks in, it will have cut off at a certain point, and this could create clicks. You can hear a click. It's difficult to hear. Some samples are worse than others. So what I do is I take the very final part of it, go Effect, Fade Out. And what that does is that fades it out towards, when you fade out and you fade in, you want to go towards what's called the zero crossing, which is that middle line. Anything that fades out towards the zero crossing, anything that stops at the zero crossing will probably not click. That's nice. That sounds okay now. So that's now nice and tight. It's not even 100 milliseconds long. Now, what I want to do now is normalize it. You go Effect, Normalize. Now, don't normalize towards 0 dB because it will get too loud. You can check in the top left here your levels. Give yourself some headroom. So I normalize to -4 decibels. And you see what it's done is made it slightly louder and made these quite a bit even slightly louder. If you look at the actual level here, it's going up into amber. Okay. Let's try another one. And you can hear a click at the end on that one. Listen. Click at the end. That click is going to get very annoying. So let's just pull this up and see where the actual tails are. Sometimes it doesn't do a very good job and it leaves a very long tail on them where there genuinely is no sound. You can see there's a long tail where there's some sound. So I'm just going to fade now out here. Control Fade Out. Might be difficult to hear on this recording, but that click has gone. So now I can just go. Now sometimes normalize will actually make a sample quieter. It's only just made this very slightly louder. Some samples are going to get quieter. what you can do is you can go File, Export as WAV, and it's okay, you can export it over the top. It says you want to replace, and Audacity is nice. It creates a backup file for you. So if I look in this folder now, it's actually saved the old version anyway. So what you've got there is a sample that's been trimmed down. It's got a really close start point. It's not too loud. It goes up. It doesn't even. This one doesn't even go all the way up into amber. It's nice, about the right kind of level. It's got a fade out. Now, actually, let's just see if we can find a longer sample where we might actually want to chop the tail off, because, yeah, okay, you don't necessarily want to lose much of your sound, but if you've got something that's got an incredibly long tail, this has got quite a long tail and a click at the end, I might choose to actually say, do you know what, to save some time on my TR-8S, I was going to chop a little bit off this, because we get towards the end here and it's getting very quiet and it's quite a long tom sample. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to chop up about 30 milliseconds off, and then the same rules apply. Select a bit, fade out. Then normalize it, and then there we go, nice clean tom. And if you look at these waves, if I just zoom into these waves, you can tell the recording's relatively clean. These waves look nice and clean. If I'd recorded from a dirty source, then you'd see there'd be more interference here. You can actually see these are almost kind of halfway between a triangle and a sine wave. These are nice clean waves. So you can trust that this sample is going to be okay. It's in the mono field. Okay, that's fine. So the actual TR-8S can put the stereo elements back in with effects and panning. This gives you kind of an all-purpose tom that you can put in the mix any way you want. If it's too loud, so if I normalize everything to -4 dB, some things might be a little bit too loud, but it's okay. On the TR-8S, you can just adjust the gain and turn it down a little bit. So the other thing is, if you've got a drum that's got a bit more of a slower attack. Some instruments, not so much drums. Drums tend to have this kind of harsh attack transient that you see here, this kind of squiggly line here. If you've got an instrument or a sample that's got a longer attack, you might have to put a fade in as well, because the same thing applies to the end, to the beginning. You can end up with a click. So what you can do is you can just select the very beginning and go fade in. And what that's going to do is that's going to make sure it won't make much difference on this one because it's got such a hard attack transient. But what it's going to do is it's going to remove any clicking from the beginning on a sample that's got a longer attack. So remember, fade in, fade out, normalize, cut tails off if you want to, but be careful. Make sure you zoom in so you can actually see what you're cutting off, because you might be cutting off an important part of kind of the decay of an instrument. Now, the other thing for loops, if you are recording loops, there's a BPM finder. I don't know if I've got it open on my Windows. Oh, I don't. There's a BPM finder online and BPM calculator. So if you're doing 120 BPM, you know that a bar is going to be 2 seconds long, exactly. You know, that's an easy example. That's a very, very easy example. So because 4 beats is going to be on a bar, for a full note, it's going to be 2 seconds long. So if you're sampling something, if you're sampling something like a loop, what you want to do is start your loop at an attack transient like this, at the start of a bar. So understand the music, start off at an attack transient, and then record the length you need. Now, actually, also, your loop might be the wrong BPM. Now, luckily, there's loads of places online that tell you the BPM for popular songs. So if you've got a song that's, I think, Grooves in the Heart is something like 89 BPM, and I wanted it to be 120 to pep it up, I can calculate the length of a bar at 89 using an online tool. It's a little bit more complicated than 120, but it's still not that hard to figure out. Record a full bar or just a little bit more than a full bar, because if you're triggering it on a drum on a drum loop on every bar, it will re-trigger anyway. So if you've got slightly too much, it doesn't matter too much. But as long as you get the beginning right, you record a full bar. What you can do is you can use the change BPM effect. So you can go change tempo, and what you can do is you can put your original tempo in. We'll say the original is 89. And what I'm going to do is say my new one is 120. And what it'll do is it'll stretch it. And you can click this button here. This is important here, high quality stretching. Now I think in Audacity by default that also affects the pitch. But you can also do change pitch to actually adjust it back to pitch, whatever pitch you want. You might want it pitched up. If you make something shorter, if you make something quicker, then it's going to go up in pitch. If you make something slower, if you lower the BPM, then it's going to make it actually sound lower. So using these tools, you can actually not only capture samples, but you can capture loops as well that you can play on your TR-8S. So obviously once you're done with these samples, what I tend to do is I tend to put them on an individual directory within the TR-8S for that particular kit. I tend to choose 11 specifically, ones that I think form a kit. I might sample hundreds of things, but what I'll do is I'll choose from the hundreds and hundreds of things I've recorded. Go back into one of my other kits here. I've got an ER1 kit. I mean, I've got an awful lot of samples here, but what I might do is I might just choose something. I might choose 11 of them to make a kit. Maybe not that one, but anyway, I'll choose 11 of those and I'll create a directory called, we'll call it ER1 kit. I'll give it the name of the song you are recording. Put them all on there and then import the entire folder using the folder import function on the TR-8S. And that just makes things a lot easier. Now, obviously, if you're going to use that kit across multiple different TR-8S projects and multiple pans, then what you might want to do is actually export that, save that kit and export it and keep it on your own PC, keep a library of your own kits. So there is actually in the utilities menu, you can export kits, as well as you can do a full system backup, which I recommend if you're doing a lot of recording. Make sure backups, because someday you might have to do a factory reset on your TR-8S. So I think that's just about it. So what have we talked about? We've talked about getting levels right. We've talked about recording a backing track like this, which is separate to leave your own audio cues. We've talked about how we can remove noise from noisy instruments. We've talked about how we can take an entire stream of sounds and use the silence finder and the export multiple to cut them up. We've shown how we can use macros to trim silence. I mean, I'm pretty sure that a lot of the stuff I did with the normalization and the kind of fade out piece, I could probably do in a macro as well to speed up my own workflow. And that should give you the ability to create quite quickly lots and lots of very usable samples for the TR-8S. I'm not a mastering expert, I'm not a studio expert, but these are usable samples. They're clean and they're efficient in space, and you can do this too because it's relatively simple. I think one final note is try to avoid recording directly from your computer if you can help it, or recording to your computer instead of using a professional quality recorder. I've always found that the quality of the jacks and of the DACs and everything on board computers isn't always the best. An external audio interface or recorder is probably a better option for you. Well, I hope this has helped. I'll see you soon.